So there have been many different iterations of a Green New Deal, from those put forward by politicians to think tanks. And most of these have surfaced in the global north, where the phrase has captured imaginations on the connections between economic, political, and social justice, whether that's protecting workers' rights or addressing inequities. And the connections between that with climate justice, that is something that the mainstream climate movement in the global north has traditionally failed to do. Most Green New Deal conceptions attempt to either use state power or campaign for state power through green and red policies. For example, groups like Labour for a Green New Deal Rising, those linked with Stop Cambo, Fuel Poverty Action, Warm This Winter, and Don't Pay, are really likely to have influenced British Labour leader Keir Starmer's proposal for a green prosperity plan. These groups, among many others, have been campaigning for things like making sure no family is pushed into fuel poverty as a result of energy rises that are completely outside of families' control. That the huge amount of household energy that's wasted through drafty, leaky, and poorly insulated homes, which cause poor health outcomes as well as high bills, is addressed through green upgrades that can keep houses warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer without the need for as much energy. And that there is a democratic transition away from fossil fuels in a way that creates millions of new jobs, including for those currently in the fossil fuel industry. These campaigns and the positive livelihood and climate impacts that they seek to win are crucial. But there are structural limitations with mainstream notions of Green New Deals, and I'm going to try and outline some of these here in a very non-exhaustive manner. And I'm not doing this to say that reforms should not be organized for and researched and won. That is absolutely essential. But my hope is that in the process of running campaigns to improve policies of governments and those in opposition, that campaigners and researchers contributing to them also develop, cultivate, and spread awareness of the need to seek bolder and more systemic changes over time. First, most Green New Deals promote targets that are grossly insufficient and not in keeping with the scale of responsibility that global North countries have to reduce emissions urgently and to support transitions in the South. They also include mechanisms for reductions that are untested and even dangerous, like carbon capture and storage or dirty hydrogen. These schemes can often be eligible for funding through green schemes that tend to support big corporations to invest in problematic tech over community-owned renewable energy schemes. How do we know what a country's fair share is? Fair share conceptions have been developed by organizations like the Climate Equity Reference Calculator and the Stockholm Environment Institute, and are based on understandings that global North countries have used up most of the carbon budget if we are to keep warming to the safest levels still attainable. Another limitation of most conceptions of Green New Deals in the North is that they assume we can maintain current levels of consumption or even grow our economies, but simply replace fossil fuels with wind energy, solar panels, and electric car batteries. But even these require lithium, cobalt, nickel, and other raw earth minerals and metals. It's estimated that to replace the UK supply of cars with electric vehicles, we need something like 2 or 3 times the world's known reserves of lithium or cobalt. It's just not possible to retain current levels of consumption. Alternative visions of collective and public transport are needed. The mining of these minerals and metals, predominantly in the south, is associated with ecosystem degradation, allegations of child labour, as well as workers and Indigenous rights violations, huge negative impacts on health, livelihoods, and much more. It also repeats colonial notions of extractive plunder. In November 2020, it was revealed that the European Commission hired BlackRock, the world's biggest investment fund, to give paid advice on how to make the banking sector more sustainable. The link between mainstream conceptions of Green New Deals and the corporate sector is another significant limitation. BlackRock is the world's largest asset manager with $7.8 trillion in assets. It holds investments worth 85 billion in coal companies alone, and that number excludes investment in other fossil fuel companies and companies that contribute to deforestation or the agribusiness industry. The lobbying power of corporations and the corporate capture of decision making has impacted mainstream notions of new Green Deals. Conceptions of Green New Deals that don't take into account the way in which corporate power is built into our systems structurally will also run into conflict with those systems. Systemic corporate power is built into international treaties, as well as debt, trade, and investment regimes. The Energy Charter Treaty, for example, allows energy corporations to sue governments for policies that might negatively affect their profits, including climate policies that seek to phase out coal and other dangerous projects. More broadly, trade and investment treaties maintain neo-colonial extractivism, precluding countries on the front line of climate change impacts from investing in transitions, as well as infrastructure and social schemes as climate impacts escalates. As you're watching this, communities, homes, hospitals, markets, schools, and sites of work, celebration, commemoration, ritual, and memorial are at risk of increasingly and fierce storms, disease spread, droughts, shifting seasons, temperature extremes, sea level rise, salty seawater coming onto land, glacial retreat, and flooding. Impoverishment, living with a disability, younger and older people, Indigenous communities, and those marginalized by gender, national or social origin, or other status experience magnified exposure to climate harms. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report in March 22 on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. The report found that nearly half of the global population, between 3.3 and 3.6 billion people, are already living in areas highly vulnerable to climate change, and the brief window in which to limit how intense and frequent climate impacts such as stronger storms, droughts, flooding, and sea level rise become, and to secure a livable and sustainable future for all, is rapidly narrowing. We can take just one example from earlier this year. In Pakistan, unprecedented floods killed over 1,000 people and displaced over 33 million. A quarter of Pakistan is flooded and underwater, equal to the geographic area of Britain. Analysis from Jason Hickel, published in the Lancet Medical Journal, found that as of 2015, the US, EU, UK, Russia, Japan, and Canada were together responsible for 85% of total emissions. These emissions are driving climate change impacts disproportionately in countries least responsible for climate change. Every fraction of a degree of warming will exacerbate the scale and scope of impacts. Yet, UK-based oil and gas company Rockhopper Exploration can sue the Italian state for refusing to grant it a concession for oil drilling in the Adriatic Sea, enabled by the Energy Charter Treaty. But who pays when millions of people are already victim to creeping salty seawater, devastating farmlands and homes, acidifying fisheries, and destroying access to clean water from Bangladesh to the Pacific Islands? What redress is available for the survivors of those who have lost relatives, livelihoods, health, or well-being to storms that form ever more regularly and severely in places like Mozambique, or rivers that erode suddenly, causing homes and community infrastructure to be carried away by howling winds and stronger storm surges? What repair is available to those unable to grow food on land previously abundant or on the raging path of increasingly extreme fires? And what for those that have lost loved ones, toxic air, or annually record breaking and increasingly uninhabitable temperatures? While corporations can use opaque courts to protect their profits from climate action, the avenues for repair for those on the front line of climate change impacts who have done remarkably little to contribute to the crisis are scarce, and international legal infrastructures give precedence to potential lost profits than they do to protecting life, and any domestic Green New Deals will confront these unjust international contexts. So, local or national Green New Deals on their own are not enough. We need visions that are global and globally just, that seek to promote equity within countries, that's within the North and within the South, and between countries, given the North's historic responsibility. That historic responsibility for emissions continues. The average per capita emissions of citizens in countries most vulnerable to climate change impacts pales in comparison to the average emissions of a person in the US, Canada, Australia, or UK. The global poor, many of whom survive on less than $2 a day, generate almost no greenhouse gas emissions, but are disproportionately impacted by climate change impacts. That is grotesquely unfair and requires a global response that is reparative and proportional. And Green New Deals that are based on aid or climate finance alone, but do not address historic injustices that led to wealth being accumulated by those most responsible for emissions, is really insufficient. Colonialism fundamentally reconfigured the world economy. India's share of the global economy shrank from 27 to 3%, while the UK benefited by approximately $45 trillion from its colonial rule of the Indian subcontinent alone. And China's share shrank from 35% of the global economy to 7%, while Europe's exploded from 20 to 60%. And climate change impacts sit on top of colonial and neo-colonial forms of extractivism that most Green New Deals do not take into account. In comparison, the need for a wider concept of justice to be central to any response to our escalating climate crisis is not new in the South. While the Green New Deal framing has not really gained traction in the South, visions around the need for systems change, climate reparations, an eco-social pact of the South, and more have flourished for decades. In the book that we co-edited, and which includes voices from around the world, Perspectives on a Green New Deal, Dalia Gabriel and I try to bring these conversations to the movements pushing for a Green New Deal. There's lots I haven't been able to cover today, but do visit global-gnd.com if you're interested in hearing from over 30 voices from the climate justice movement on the need for structural and systemic change.